Once you get to 105, you're called a semi-super centenarian. When you get to 110, you're a super centenarian. And all of these groups are getting more and more common. Uh, the numbers are rising all the time. About 30 years ago in Europe, the prevalence rate was about 1 in 10,000 people were over 100. Now it's actually 1 in 5,000 people and dropping all the time. So although it's still a small percentage of the population, it is one of the fastest growing segments of the population. We don't know exactly where that will level off. Certainly, probably around the time when the demographic shift sort of eases with the baby boom coming through. But we don't know because of the changes in healthcare and people living quite long. And not only are there going to be more people living over 100, but the sex ratio is going to change. So right now it's about 4 to 1 women to men. It's going to drop to 2 to 1. So there's going to be more men living longer as a percentage of centenarians. So this is a very interesting sort of demographic shift, but it also means that we've got more and more people that we can study and see why and how they got to 100. Some interesting sort of data about where these folks live. This is sort of a heat map of centenarians, and the highest proportion are in sort of all the circles show sort of proportion or numbers, absolute numbers of centenarians, and the highest proportion is in red in the bottom right. That's Australia and New Zealand, a little bit in Japan, but you don't really see this on this map. Western Europe, and then after that is the Americas. And the highest proportion of centenarians are in Australia, Japan, and Puerto Rico, interestingly. As you see, richer countries seem to have more centenarians. If you look at the bottom on the B, the percentage of centenarians, most of the countries on the left side of the graph are richer countries, including us, Canada. The arrow is us. So after that, sort of the first few, which is Australia, Japan, and Puerto Rico, drops off a little bit. Some countries you wouldn't expect, like Vietnam, have a lot of centenarians. Dominican Republic and Chile not as rich, but then you've got the Western European countries, us, the UK, Switzerland, USA, New Zealand, Ireland, etc. And then it drops off as you get towards the poorer countries. So interesting sort of overall demographics, and it sort of makes you wonder about the different reasons why people live to 100, and we'll go through some of that. And so you may have heard of as well about these blue zones. And this was a book that was written a little while back. I'm sure you've heard of it. These blue zones, which are these little clusters in certain countries of places where there were an enormous number of, by percentage, prevalence of centenarians. So on this blue bar is Okinawa, which has double the prevalence of centenarians than the rest of Japan, which is the next lowest bar at 48 per 100,000. And you see how much more, maybe the difference between Okinawa and the US, it's 4 times the number of centenarians by prevalence. So a lot of interest, obviously, about how these blue zones, why do these people live so long? It's pretty clear and this is sort of spoiler, is that it's a mix of genetics and environmental factors. This is the bottom line. But what are they? How do they interact? Why are certain places particularly likely to have centenarians? So that's what we'll talk about. So if you don't know about Okinawa, this was came out of a study by Dr. Suzuki back in 1975. The world's longest continuously running study of centenarians have studied 1,000 people in Okinawa that are over 100 and did all sorts of medical, physiological tests. And when they looked at them, these people have clean arteries, low cholesterol. So, like, no plaque in these arteries at all. And we always joke in geriatrics that it's like, well, why do we need to prove that someone over 85 has atherosclerotic plaques in their heart or in their vertebral arteries? Everybody does. Everybody does. Not so. There's certain people that just don't, and they've got arteries that look like a 30-year-old or a 20-year-old. Not only do they have clean arteries, they have much less hormone-dependent cancers. Prostate and breast cancer, very rare. Very strong bones, half the risk of hip fractures from other Asian people. And when they did all the physiological studies, they're not just internally healthy, they have lean, fit bodies. Um, this picture of this gentleman doing exercises, calisthenics like this, no problem. Able to exercise just like a middle-aged person, even younger, and then no issues with mental issues, no cognitive impairment at all. So what this is telling us is that there's these people and this huge cluster in Okinawa, but in other blue zones as well, and then other areas of the world where people just don't age like everybody else. Are they actually healthier than other seniors? Yes. This is quite a remarkable. I mean, we know that seniors are heterogeneous, but these are a small group of people, one in a few hundred, one in 1,000, one in 5,000, and they have almost no medical age-related diseases. They don't have vascular-related diseases. They don't have diabetes. They don't get Parkinson's disease. They don't get cancer. This has been proven in these studies of centenarians. And not only that, they remain independent with their basic care well into their 90s. It's just quite something. Little aside, we do know that as you saw, as I mentioned, there are more women than men in this age category, but over time, they are getting more. There's more men living this long, and men that do get to 100 tend to have better cognitive and physical status even than women that live to 100. So these are like super survivors. They tend to be not at all sick. So if you're a 100-year-old man, you're actually very likely to have very few syndromes and very little illness. So that's the good side. Even though less men live to 100, if you do get to 100, you're actually very healthy for the most part. So very interesting. There's on the one end of the scale, there's people who are living incredibly healthily for very long, right to the end of our natural lifespan as human beings. So why? Let's think about aging and how this might look, not just for centenarians, but all people that get to about 80, 85. So there's two main sort of theories, explanations, ways you can think about living a long time. One is that what we're always trying to strive for in geriatrics is trying to compress morbidity. So if you think about three groups of people, so in the first model, this is sort of very usual aging. You're going along, you're fairly healthy, you get to about middle age, things start to deteriorate. The yellow and the red start coming on, more diseases, more risk factors. By the time you get to about 75, more functional dependence. And then around 80, 85, 90, you die. In the second model, maybe, and this is probably happening with a lot of people, unfortunately, and this is what we see in geriatrics. Same sort of thing, maybe not so unwell in the Middle Ages, but but so sort of later in life, more like in their 60s and 70s, starting to have more diseases and disabilities. But then the morbidity does tend to build, and unfortunately, that red part of the arrow on the second model is that they're living with disability for quite a while, living longer. Where because of our medical care, you're not dying of the stroke, you're not dying of the heart attack that you had when you were 80, you're not dying of the cancer, but the morbidity and the illnesses and the dysfunction does tend to still build up and around, and you're living longer, and some of these people are getting to 100, but then they still are they're dying, but um, that morbidity is still there. And that's not really what we want. We do want people, I mean, living longer is nice, but no one is wishing for living longer and having more years of disability. So in geriatrics, what and with all of the work that we're trying to do with people living longer, is that we want that green to stay as green as possible, and that those diseases and the dysfunction to only build up towards the end. And those people that are well enough, and a lot of these centenarians, certainly the Okinawa type centenarians, that's what's happening to them, that they're very, very well towards their 100th year, and very, very tight morbidity timeline. And that's kind of what we're striving for. And there's certain people that can get there, but not everybody. So you have to be careful that with our medical interventions, that we're having too many people move from the first model of aging to the second model, and not enough people moving into the third model of aging, which is compressing that morbidity into the very last little part of your life. But we also know that some people do seem to age faster than normal. And we see this in the hospital all the time, is people that, you say, oh, 50 years old, but multiple diseases, not doing well, functionally impaired. And they seem to actually be aging faster. And we're seeing this in geriatrics more and more, where we're getting asked to see more 6-year-olds and 55-year-olds, unfortunately. We don't really want to see those folks. We're really more interested in people that are older, but we do see accelerated aging. But then there's also this other group, like people in Okinawa, and that are decelerated aging. And that is, again, what we're trying to do. Not only compress that morbidity, which is when we see the aging and when we see the dysfunction, but also just overall your aging, the way your cells age, your joints age, your body ages, is going to slow down. And so that when you get that to the dotted line, which is when the diseases come, you've already been like way past when most people are getting diseases and most people are getting dysfunction. So that's two parts of that sort of like how we want to move people towards both compression of morbidity, but also decelerated aging as much as possible. So it's not just about diseases. So how do you get there? That's going to be the question, I know, is on your minds. How do you get, I mean, you don't live in Okinawa. You might live in Richmond, which probably has some of the same demographics and some of the same forces. So maybe you are lucky enough to live in Richmond, but even living in the Lower Mainland and BC being one of the healthiest provinces, you're sort of in a leg up. But how do you get to be in that green decelerated age, and how do you get to that green compression of morbidity? So clearly, genetics plays a part, particularly of people that get to 100. So when they've studied the genetics of people that are centenarians, the mitochondrial RNA profile, so that's not your DNA that you got from your parents necessarily, but even the RNA that's in your mitochondria is actually different from a matched person who got to their 80s. So people that get to their 80s in the West are fairly healthy, but if you're going to get to 100, there's actually probably a different genetic profile that actually is able to push you to that long lived genetic makeup. Um, they have different mitochondrial RNA. They have anti-apoptotic factors. So there's various genes that overexpress these proteins in older people, in centenarians, that actually have that uh, make it so that cells don't die. So apoptosis is when cells die, and they actually have proteins that keep cells alive compared to people that are in their 70s. And they have genes that seem to be able to are pluripotent, so they have various different pathways that these genes can go, and they are activated. And again, they protect against cells getting old and cells dying. So at the cellular level, at the genetic and cellular level, many centenarians are genetically quite different from even people that get to their 70s and 80s. And that's why when you have a family of centenarians, and you'll meet people like this, they say, oh, my mother lived to 100, my uncle lived to 100, my grandmother actually lived to 100 in the 60s, which was like incredible. And we're seeing this more and more, these families where people are incredibly long lived. And if they, your older generations were smokers and worked in the mines and everything, but now you've got multiple generations that are living very long, and we're seeing this more and more. And the genetics is definitely there. So if you're lucky enough, hopefully, to have a genetic background, whether it's one parent or both sides of your family who have these long-lived genes, you're set up very well to get both to very old age, over 100, and also healthily to that age. What about other non-genetic, or what we think are non-genetic factors in centenarians? Uh, these folks have been studied to have less oxidative stress. They seem to have, we're always talking about antioxidants, eating antioxidants, but they have like innate antioxidant defenses that are better than the population. And then when you look at their immune function, their endocrine function, the hormonal function, their metabolic profile in terms of cholesterol, thyroid, etc., um, just sort of healthier and protecting against what we call inflammaging, or the inflammatory changes, and the syndrome, we just call it syndrome X of aging, where high cholesterol, diabetes, hypothyroidism, insulin insensitivity, obesity, all these things, they just don't tend to go there, even if their diet isn't great, or even if they maybe smoked for a while when they were younger. They're just like their body systems seem to be just a little bit better at protecting against all of those things that we see with aging. Diet and exercise certainly seems to influence it, and seems to be sort of, if you have better diet and exercise, you have better metabolic profile, which means you probably are able to exercise better. And then a lot of interest in the microbiome. So how you diet and how you eat, how you exercise, some of the other sort of inflammatory immunological things that happen in your early middle age. How does that affect the gut bacteria that you have, and how does that help in turn help you protect against inflammation, oxidative stress, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these body symptoms, body systems are working better in folks that live longer. And some of it is probably genetic, as I said, but some of this is about your environment, and some of this is about your behaviors. So I've talked a bit about disease. there's these definitions of to look at aging by disease onset. So that's one way to look at it. And they've tried to break down centenarians to people who are survivors. So this would actually be like my mother, who has an age associated illness, only one, but has an age associated illness prior to age 80. But whether it's from good medical care or luck, or the fact that she only has one disease, she's going to get past 80 and she's going to do fine. Hopefully she's going to survive this sort of the 65 to 80-year-old thing, and she's going to keep trucking along past 80. There's some people who seem very healthy until they get to about 80, and then we've seen this a lot, you know, healthy as a horse, and then boom, cognitive impairment, a cancer, and they come on around 80, 75 to 85 to 90, and then things do start to fall off and frailty still comes on. So those are the delayers. Live quite well to the age of 80, but then that compression of morbidity is there, but they are still falling off and they don't really get to 100 a lot of times. And then there's the escapers, the people from Okinawa. They get to 100, totally healthy, no age-associated illnesses, still walking the dog, still, doing the push-ups, etc. And that's a small proportion of people. So you can look at people by that definition, or look at aging by definition of disease. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And when we want to intervene, we probably have to look at it a little bit differently. This I really liked, which is really looking at some of you see the biological reserve. So that's your genetics. Part of that is talked about in terms of your environment. And then there's your intrinsic capacity to change and to fight diseases and to stay healthy. And then there's your psychological assets, which are partly your genetics, or partly the way you were parented, partly your environment, how you grew up, your education, your spouse, some of the things that may have happened to you or not happened to you, whether, did you live through a war or did you live through a very peaceful time? So all of those assets come, some of it's nature, some of it's nurture. Down below, you've got your social network. That again is partly you, but it's also where you live. Your cultural background, how strong is your community, and then your economic support. As I said, richer countries have more people that live longer and they stay healthy for longer. We've known that for many, many years. So there's all these different bits and pieces. Some are nurture, some are nature. And then you get either resilience on one side, whether or not you get osteoporosis or a cancer, or your spouse dies, are you resilient enough, or do you succumb to aging? And it becomes a circular sort of thing. Once you get a big thing and you're not resilient, the aging starts to happen. And we know that frailty can actually be accelerated by all of these things falling apart. So I think instead of thinking about disease, it's really thinking about resilience in the face of obstacles as you age. And so that positive concept is really coming out in a lot of the literature. And what is your capacity? Now, if you get thrown 8 diseases and you get, and you lose a whole bunch of people in your family, and you live, and then there's a war starts in your community, or you become poor for whatever reason, at a certain point, as much resilience as you have, you will succumb, and frailty will take over and you will age. But the more you have in your bank to sort of approach all of those things that are thrown in your way, some of it's luck, some of it's your genes, then you will be able to stay resilient. And aging is a multi sort of dimensional thing that happens to you. It's not just your age, and it's not just your diseases. So I think that's really important sort of model of aging that we need to continue to build on as we see more people getting older. I will say during COVID, we saw this a lot. The effects of one part, the social network, and some of the psychological assets. People were more lonely, they were more isolated, and they lost their social network. And then they stopped doing things, partly because they were told they couldn't go out and do things in groups, and their resilience dropped. And people that I've had many patients that have come in and their families, and they say, I was okay until 2020. That's the year that everything started to fall apart. I was 82 and then I was 83 in 2020 and things went downhill. And that wasn't necessarily just turning 83. That was probably a multifactorial thing. Yes, you turned from 82 to 83, but also all those that in terms of that three-legged stool, one of the legs was pulled out from under you. And that's we've been really trying to examine that. But it's been a common story that we've seen. When did mom start to deteriorate? 2020. It's not a coincidence. So again, so resilience to stressors, and it's not just diseases, it's infections. So whether it's COVID or RSV or pneumonia, can you maintain your fitness? Are you able to heal? Is your cognitive status stable? All of these things, there is a resilience to this that can protect you against deterioration. Some of it is sort of an interaction between your environment, so what you eat, how you exercise, your hormones, are you sleeping enough? We're learning more about that in terms of cognitive impairment being tied to poor sleep for long periods of your life, not sleeping very well. And that actually might affect some of the things that happen in your RNA, some of the epigenetic changes like your telomeres, all these cellular things. Some of this is actually affecting your cells themselves and the genes within your cells. And then how does education protect? How does just learning new things actually develop those neuronal connections and help you cope with stress? How does anxiety and depression change your hormones? It's all really interconnected when you start delving deeply into it. And then the resilience to all of these things is really multifactorial. So yes, centenarians are probably quite different from the rest of us. That small proportion of people have the ones that are lucky enough that have a specific genetic set, but they're also remarkably able to withstand stressors. They're not aging fast, but it's probably not just their genes. It's definitely their genes and other things. And it will be interesting as we see everyone's been really worried about the baby boom coming into this demographic shift, more old people than young people. But we're also seeing, we're starting to see it already, is that more people who are over 65 are actually fitter than we ever seen before, right into their 80s, 90s, and 100s. And we don't really know the balance between, yes, there's more old people, there will be more diseases, but people are fitter, are more likely to take care of themselves, especially where we live here in BC. So that it's really hard to predict exactly what things will look like in 20 or 30 years because aging looks different than it did in the 1950s. So you really can't predict it based on what's happened before. So it's very interesting. And that's why ageism is even more important to press against. Ageism, as you know, prejudice or discrimination on the grounds of a person's age, just a number. And then that overall societal lack of worth or dignity because someone is older. So someone, if they're 65, 75, 85, just aren't worth as much as someone who's 35, and that's ageism. But now, as older people become, they're not the 80-year-olds of 1977, and they're also, they're becoming older and they're more fit, they're more able, and the heterogeneity between there's still some people that are aging very quickly, whether it's their genes or their lifestyle or the diseases that are unlucky enough to have. But now we've got even more people who are fit, and that number is meaning less and less as we go on. So that old societal ageism that is embedded in our Western society has to be pushed back on even stronger, because that's what we're seeing. There, you really just cannot tell the difference between, you can't say anything about an 8-year-old until you really delve into who they are and are they actually frail? Because if a frail person has cancer, has a heart attack, has a big stroke, it the outcomes are poor. And that is true. And there's no reason to, you know, spend a whole lot of money and push medical treatment that really is futile in terms of improving their quality of life. But then if someone isn't frail and is actually very fit and is robust and is resilient and able to get through this disease that they have, then we should be helping them to do that. So that two sides of the ageism coin, not only knowing when to stop giving high-tech care or focusing just on quality life, but also when to give that care that will prolong someone's life and keep them healthy and robust. So that nuance is, yes, a number doesn't mean anything, but also we do have to understand frailty, morbidity, function, and when the limits of our of medical care are there, and be honest about it. So again, getting away from that number of age as a number, but also understanding the heterogeneity and the complexity and the beautiful sort of complexity of aging. One last thing I will talk about, a big thing has come up in the last 5 years. You're hearing a ton more, and I think because of the lockdowns and COVID, it became even more so that this idea of social prescribing. We've got levels of loneliness and isolation in seniors more than ever before. True of younger demographics, but even more so of our seniors, that we need to fight loneliness and social isolation, that we have to work on the social determinants of health, income, appropriate housing, and then, as I said, about ageism. And there's nothing magical about the word prescribing, this notion of social prescribing, but just trying to make sure that we understand that it's not just drugs and chemicals that make people better, that health is actually something that comes from this multifactorial and multidimensional human holistic sort of who you are, and that things that are between people and those interactions with people is really, really important and part of that resilience. So let's go back to the old. So I've talked a lot about what we know about aging that's a little bit different, but in the end, this is really kind of an old idea. Healthy behaviors starting in early childhood will optimize your quality of life. So healthy living tends to cause healthy aging. And this is sort of, you might have an easy time of it. You might live in a very rich country. You might have good genes. You might have a lot of money. You might have a good, all the lucky things in life. Or you might have the other. You might be dealt a fairly bad hand. But in terms of the interventions, you can still get to the same place. It's just a little harder when you start with the sort of not such a great hand, rather than some people that are just, have all the benefits of a good nature and a good nurture. And so everyone can be improved in terms of their quality of life as long as you go back to the basics. So what works? We have to prevent and treat disease. That's a big part of why we're living past 80 in a big way, is looking at diseases, heart disease, stroke, endocrine disease, etc. But diet and exercise, very key. Education and a lifelong learning new things will keep you more psychologically and socially active. Intrinsic psychological factors like being positive, being happy, we're studying happiness more. Resilience, what does that mean to you? How can resilience help you sort of forge ahead with some of the things that come up? Your own sense of worth, whether that's from work, volunteerism, multi-generational uh, uh, interactions, and all of those other social connections, community, meaningful encounters, not just putting people in a group, but actually meaningful encounters that give them that quality of life. So it's old stuff. We're just learning now how important it is, and really how much more important it is than that next Ozempic or fancy pill. That aging is much more complex. So I've talked a lot. I hope I've made some sense. What is the future of aging? That was a big topic that Mary Lou gave me. I think we understand aging better than ever before, although we are learning more and more every year. Aging is getting more heterogeneous in different populations, and we're seeing this across the world, that aging is just a very complex situation that we're seeing as we get more and more people who are getting into their older decades. And so when we intervene, it has to be multifactorial and span multiple domains of health, that we understand that health and quality of life is much more broad than just disease-based. And that is it. I hope that was useful to you.